Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope everyone had a nice Thanksgiving. I'm Julian Zelizer. This is the Long View, and this is Office Hours, my weekly meeting with all of you. I'm doing it from my actual office today at Princeton University. I'll give a few minutes for everyone to sign in. I see people are joining. Again, it's really nice to see familiar names. And the way this works for everyone who is new, hi, Don. Everyone who is new, you can just send in some questions that you have on the chat or issues you'd like to discuss. Doesn't even have to be a question, and I will try to address them. A couple announcements, which I always start with. My foreign policy piece isn't out quite yet just because of the holiday. But the column this week will focus on the history of the filibuster and problems with the filibuster and why there's been these really ongoing demands to reform what that is. So I walk you through the history of the filibuster and give some context to the discussions that will reemerge, have reemerged today in 2025. Hi, good morning. Notes from Underdog. And then tomorrow's piece will come out in the Long View, and I hope you enjoy it. I wrote about something I've talked here about, which is about, I don't want to give it all away, but the importance of norms in American politics, informal norms, and how essential it is to having leaders who will uphold them. And I dropped last Friday an interview with historian Eileen Boris as part of their generation, the ongoing interviews with historians who remade how we think of history after the 1960s, and hope you like that. And I did a conversation with John Gans, who some of you might know. You've read his book on the 1990s about the relationship with the right wing and mainstream conservatism historically. Please send in some questions now, and I can get started. The final thing is this week, so far, I have three interviews lined up. Keisha Blaine, a professor at Brown University, will be joining me to talk about a wonderful new book that she has. Um, okay, I'm just writing that one down. About a history of Black women who've been incredibly influential at different points in American politics. Peter Baker, the New York Times, will join Friday to discuss issues related to the presidency and where things are. John Alter and I will have then and now, and I'm going to probably add at least one more interview. Okay, we got two good questions. Bob, in terms of how does the nation get rid of Donald Trump? Look, I think it is fair to say, and I know people have different opinions, that you're seeing real fractures in the MAGA coalition. And I think that's very significant, frankly. I don't think it's a crack up, meaning that his coalition has fallen apart. I did write in my newsletter last week that I do think people overstate the strength of his coalition. It's always been fragile. He didn't win the popular vote in 2016. MAGA Republicans have performed poorly in all the midterms, and he lost in 2020, and in 2024 he won. But we forget, we don't take into account the extraordinary circumstances of who he was competing against, just meaning the volatility of the Democratic nomination, the fact that the nominee who ultimately ran had a few weeks really to put a national campaign, and the bias that exists toward women, Black Americans, and more. And he didn't win a majority. And so it's always fragile. I do think you're seeing natural division. Some of it is unique, meaning that it's happening over the Epstein files. But some of what we're seeing is exactly what you'd expect, in fact, a little earlier than you'd expect it. It is the realization on Capitol Hill that I talked about this, how Lyndon Johnson always thought about these schedules, but it happens by the midterms in a second term that you're dealing with a lame duck. And I know all the talk about him trying to run again and his social media posts, but I think fewer Republicans are thinking that way, and they're seeing his weakness. They're seeing the cost he brings to the Republican Party electorally. And that's when this becomes dangerous because Republicans are thinking of what comes next. Um, um, and so I didn't see all of that, but um, I'm gonna deal with that. So anyway, I actually do think some of the strength of his coalition is falling apart, and I think when does it end? It will end at the end of his term. And I think it's very fair to say, and more likely to say, you're going to have less Republican enthusiasm for his trying to overturn what the Constitution now says, that you can only serve 2 terms. I understand it might very well still happen, but I do think, Bob, that is the path. I do think if the House turns to the Democrats after the midterms, it's not improbable. We might have another impeachment. There's more than enough issues already on the table to trigger that. And I assume there will be more. We're already seeing now, with even Republicans joining in the criticism of the attacks on the war boats and violations of law, with the second firing on a boat. Even more Republicans are coming to be around to that position. I don't think you're going to have a situation very different than you did in 2019, 2020, where there would be few Republicans to support it. So he's not going to be. I find it very improbable at this point, although we'll see anything other than his term ending. So the real question is how much opposition mounts on Capitol Hill in the coming years as the dynamics of the next presidency change toward what he is doing. And again, as a student of political history, as a student of the Trump presidency, I understand the limits of how much that reaction might take place given Republican loyalty. But I do think you're seeing more of it. And if Democrats can put together a pretty solid victory, even with a narrow majority, I think that could change the dynamics very, very much. And so that's really the question, rather than when he goes. Finally, on this point, Bob, Trumpism will not go away. I mean, you might think of it as the MAGA Republican Party. I understand where the term comes from, but this is a new generation. They're very much on the same page with policy. And there will be pullback, you can imagine, within the Republican Party to some of the most extreme elements of what the administration has done. But I don't think you're going to have a wholesale change in what the party is about in the foreseeable future. Lynn asked about the National Guard, and we'll see. It's an unfolding story, tragic, horrible story to see what happened. Clearly, in terms of just policy, it has had 2 immediate effects. One is his announcement, President Trump, that he will be sending and deploying troops to protect the National Guard. That was inevitable. The question is not so much what happens in DC, but does this become a rationale for him to continue and accelerate what he already was trying to do in other cities where the use of federal forces, I think, by all accounts, is not so much to deal with even just protecting federal agents who are already put there in provocative fashion, but to send a statement to blue cities and sometimes blue states about how far he will go, and to have that federal presence in front of your face in cities like Chicago. I imagine this is the exact, kind of event that could trigger that. The second area we're seeing, and the Times talked about it today. I think it was on the Daily, if I remember, where what I was listening to while I was working out is just a very sudden and rapid change in policy toward people seeking various forms of refugee status here in the United States, where within days he has really clamped down not only in the ability of many people to come into this country, but from what the article was saying, retroactively questioning and challenging those who have already gone through legal processes and are here. The article pointed out that from what we know, this person was radicalized here as opposed to overseas. Kind of that already raises questions about the idea of closing everything down. There's some conservatives who are warning, and I think the Wall Street Journal had an editorial on this, if I'm correct. I might not be, that this could have huge implications in future military conflicts, obviously, when we need the assistance of local people. And part of how you get that is guaranteeing them protection and safety. But I do think this is an area of policy where it's kind of always looking for windows to push forward because there's so much pushback often from the courts, so much pushback from citizens that this becomes a window. But we will see. I mean, the thing about President Trump is contends with the fast moving attention dynamics of our political culture in the current age as much as he capitalizes on them. And so the bottom line is for everyone involved in politics, the windows of opportunity, as political scientists call them, that come from what are called focusing events, events often tragic in nature, sometimes a scandal, that create an opportunity to move forward with ideas that were already circulating, percolating, and in motion. I think they're diminishing in many ways because of how attention works in American politics. Something I've been thinking of writing about a little bit, to put together these two streams of what's happening. And so I think politicians really struggle to have these defining moments produce lasting change because the attention shifts so quickly on you. And so it's also likely that happens. We will see. But those are the two areas where I expect the biggest changes to take place. Again, I think really the big story right now, in my mind, politically, all comes down to these midterms and how Democrats can position themselves and what kinds of leadership changes we do or do not see between now and November. And I think that is, I mean, I am a historian who doesn't like when everyone says this is the most important X, Y, or Z in American history. But I do feel these midterms fall under being among the most important and consequential potentially, given the way executive power is being used and the change of balance that Democratic control. I think we've hit a midterm that certainly is that significant. And I think in terms of what Dawn is concurring, some of this will revolve around leadership, but I know there's discussions about Schumer's future, even Jeffrey's future. I wrote about that in my foreign policy column about the mid 70s when we went through an overhaul of leadership when Democrats really challenged the power of the older committee chairs of the time. But as much as that's going to be important, as much as future candidates for the presidential election is going to be important, I really think what you learn about in studying midterms, even today, even in our social media age, is that the ground game and the grassroots operations of ordinary American voters is really the most important. The canvassing, the leaflet distribution, the candidate recruitment, all the stuff that many of you might be involved in, really the nuts and bolts is what makes midterms happen, what engages voters in a non-presidential election year. It's hard to follow where the parties are, to be honest. It's not as much reporting on that. It's often outside the media landscape. It's much more, it's easier, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, to follow leadership fights and what's happening. But that's not how these midterms will be won. So the question to look at right now is, can, if you are a supporter of the Democrats, can you, as a Democrat, recreate some of what Republicans did, for example, in 2010, when it was very much a kind of powerful groundwork operation that brought the Tea Party to town? Or in 2018, there's an amazing work by Theda Skocpol, one of the great political scientists, and some of her collaborators about the role that suburban women played, starting right after the 2016 election, who were angry about where things had moved, who focused day in and day out on canvassing and organizing and candidate recruitment. And that the 2018 midterms, as much as they're anti-Trump, as much as they're about Democrats having good strategy and having necessary funds, are about suburban educated women who did the work that is needed to make sure the vote is there, the right candidates are in place, and that's more powerful than anything. So I think that is what to look for, I think, of all in the months ahead. And obviously, if you're a Democrat, if you're gonna if you feel you want to do something, that is what to do. You get involved in the local. We are in a national age of politics. It's a truism, and it's also conventional to say that, Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House, famously said, all politics is local. And since then, the argument is that's less true than it used to be. Politics has become more nationalized. Local media has changed, so people get their news from national sources. Hello, good morning from San Francisco / the bubble. Thanks for joining. Sin, if I'm pronouncing it well. And so the conventional wisdom is politics shifted. And one of the moments people study is the 1994 midterms with Newt Gingrich leading the Republicans to take over the majority of the House for the first time since 1955, and in turn, the entire Congress. But one of the things he did with the contract with America was to nationalize local races and make politics about national issues. And there's a whole literature that this has just continued. And it's very true. And I think all of that argument rests on a very strong foundation. But at the same time, I think there is a tendency to devalue the local. And local means, yes, Elizabeth, local institutions are now at the forefront of a lot of important fights. I mean, who is on the school board will have as much to do with the kind of your children, their experience in the coming years, their opportunities, the restrictions that they face, as who's in the White House and who's in Congress. And I think local government matters very much in a place like New York City. As much as we focus on mayors and the senators and representatives, the city council is important. And I can go through all the lists, but then there's the local that's different. It's the traditional local elements that I think at some level O'Neill was very cognizant of as a member. Members of the House know this. It's local organization for nationally significant elections. And the parties that really succeed are the parties that do this incredibly well. I think the parties that struggle are the parties that ultimately don't nurture that local organization. And the second, another reason we're beyond second that it's important is there's a really also terrific scholarship. Um, yes, that is true. We'll get to that in a second. There's a lot of really good scholarship that um, one of the big issues we face today is we have a very partisan politics and divided Washington, divided state legislatures, but people's attachment to parties, even if they are very partisan in their voting, has thinned. And that parties are just something you give money to via text or talk about with your friends or dislike with your family. But really, what we have lost since the 19th century and much of the 20th century is an intense set of institutions that connect the party in Washington to the people on the ground. And I think it's a project that's certainly important if you're a Democrat and you want to win control to making sure that happens. But it's also important to changing the kind of partisanship we have. It's not about ending partisanship, but I think it's healthier if people are actually engaged in the parties they support. The stakes become much clearer. The civic involvement is worth a lot, I think, politically in terms of who we are as a nation. And I do think from my own experience is that participating in politics, when you really do that kind of work, gives you a different feel for how to do it. And it gives you a different feel for people opposed who are doing it, as opposed to sitting around and just yelling and screaming and having strong feelings. So I think the local politics is also so important to creating stronger parties. And yes, I think parties are essential. And I wrote a book in defense of partisanship, which talks about it. But I think reconstituting the civic connection is very important. Um, I lost my own handwriting is bad. I can't remember the point that Lynn had raised. And Tricia, though, yes, a political version of Bowling Alone, very good. Bowling Alone was a book by Robert Putnam, a scholar at Harvard. And he wrote years ago at this point, Tricia, which it's a really powerful book. And it argued that the civic institutions, a lot of the civic institutions Americans depended on, really in periods like the 1940s and 50s and 60s, like bowling leagues, which is where the book comes from, were really important to kind of the health of our democracy. And they've thinned. People are not involved in as much of them. And he wrote the book pre-internet and social media. I mean, it was just forming, where I think it's gotten even more pronounced, obviously. And so one of the questions has been, since his book, and he's still out there talking and writing, is how do you rebuild those civic institutions? And I think they're important with regards to partisanship, Tricia, in two ways. One, I've argued that I'm also, like Don said, I think strong parties are at least inevitable in American history, and we've had parties literally since the start of the republic, and they will continue, and the divisions are real. But one of the benefits of nonpartisan civic space, it doesn't have to be a bowling league. It could be sporting events of other kinds. It could be cultural institutions. It could be the Boy Scouts, whatever. Pick your civic institutions, as they create space outside of a very partisan world where people do have interaction. And I just think it creates then a healthier way to have those strong parties, because you have this other world where you're engaged. And I often tell the story, and don't not like your Substack person for this, but I'm a New York Jets fan. I've been for my whole life, unfortunately, miserably. But I, for a long time, went to the games. And I always noted that at the games, you didn't really know where you knew some, but a lot of people, you didn't really know politically where everyone stood. It was about the sport. It was about the moment. It was about the experience. And I often thought, like, we need more of these at the local level, not big sporting events, but to create these bonds. The second part, though, which is what I think Tricia was talking about, and yes, Herman de Tocqueville is relevant, is that parties themselves can offer some of this civic space. And I think that's an underappreciated element of what they can do well when they are structured in a way where the top is not separated from the down. Thanks, Elizabeth. And I think kind of rebuilding parties from the bottom up, so the connections and the engagement of people, including young people, is stronger, is that you then have one answer to Bowling Alone through the political process. And what a kind of good thing that would be if our politics becomes, again, as it had been in the 19th century and much of the 20th century, a path toward civic engagement, a path toward citizenship, a path toward civic activism, rather than just something that's seen as divisive. We're almost out of time. Before I take the last question, as always, thank you everyone for subscribing and for joining. If you are not a paid subscriber, I hope that you might consider doing that. That is what sustains my ability to do this and to bring all the guests and all the different things I'm doing this year, including the In the Classroom series. So thank you for considering to become a paid subscriber. And I did post, it's a good gift to especially college students and high school students. A subscription will give them some access to historical conversations and knowledge, which I do feel is something a lot of young people, a lot of retired people actually, I've been pleased are enjoying this. So thank you for considering that. And finally, Herman, that's good. I think public schools have served that function. They have, they have not always served that function, and unfortunately, I think we're now in a period where they've become kind of either more divisive or there's more opt outs if you read more about homeschooling. But I think you're right. I mean, I think schools, public schools, are fantastic in that respect when they are done well. Not only do they provide a first rate education, but what they also do is they bring together people of very different backgrounds, social and economic, from very different political families, and you share a space. And you share a space not only in learning, but you share a space at the cafeteria, you share a space at parties, you share a space in the sports field. And if we don't nurture those public schools and provide them with the resources they need and the incentives for good teachers and educators, we are bowling even more alone. And I think it's something we can't afford to do, in addition to the obvious and kind of essential educational pathways that those schools provide. But like a different kind of party, robust public schools, public universities, I think they too offer a very important civic space. I will never forget my own high school experience at a public high school in New Jersey, where I did meet people from very different backgrounds at all levels that I think being with them and being friends with them and learning with them profoundly expanded my understanding of the world and made me a better citizen. So I know there's a lot of teachers on this Substack. Thank you for the work you do. Is truly, it's precious, and it's the most valuable thing we have. Thank you everyone for joining. I'll be back soon, and look for my newsletter tomorrow and a bunch of great interviews coming up this week. Take care, everyone. Be healthy, and again, happy Thanksgiving.